Welcome to the North Bay Science Discovery Day. Pleased that you're joining us for this session by Medtronic and Kurt on alternate careers in STEM. So I'll turn it over to Kurt.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you all for coming and joining. Let me pull up my slides here so we can all see. And Stephen, you let me know if everything's coming through on your end.
Yep, it's looking good.
Excellent. All right, folks, well, let's dive on in. So today's presentation, we're talking about alternate careers in STEM, and your entire day is me talking about STEM and different options and different functions within this. And I have a sneaky suspicion that many of you have probably never even heard of this career path called regulatory affairs. It is something that was relatively new to me even in the past couple of years, and I just would be a disservice not to teach you about this and just to give you some light into this. I think I recently just broke a rule of presenting. One of the rules of a presentation is you're never supposed to change your slides right before a presentation. And I kid you not, I literally just changed my slides about 5 minutes before this. So, but I think there's a good reason for that. The reason being that I realized that you probably want to know who I am before you're actually going to listen to what it is that I'm talking about. So just humor me for a second. Let me just give you a quick background about myself, and hopefully that'll allow you to relate to me a little bit more, and then we can dive into this topic about what is regulatory affairs. So basically, who am I? I am somebody who was basically in school for quite a long time. Ultimately, when I went to school out of high school, I was really passionate about physical fitness and helping people. I actually just want to be a personal trainer. That was my lifelong goal. I'm actually from Connecticut, back on the East Coast. So I did my undergrad and master's degree at a small state school in exercise science, also called kinesiology. You may see it called that in some programs. And it turns out I really enjoyed school, and I also didn't know what I wanted to do. So in that same process, I said to myself, well, why don't I just stay in school a little bit longer? And I ended up doing that. I relocated down to Florida, where I did a PhD at the University of Florida, which again just means I was in school a little bit longer. And that was still in the field of kinesiology or exercise science. And then after that point in time is when I finally relocated here to the West Coast to the Santa Rosa area. And actually for the last 5 years, I was a assistant professor then in the kinesiology program at Sonoma State University. And as you can see dated there, May 2020 is when I made a little bit of a career shift here to Medtronic. And so for just over about 10 months now, I've been what's called a Regulatory Affairs Specialist at Medtronic. And so we'll get to what that means here in a minute, but I figured you'd want to just hear a little bit more about my background before I could kind of beat you over the head with this career path. Now, there's a lot more detail within this career path. So that's sort of my educational pedigree, as we call it. But within that, I've done a whole lot of things. As I alluded to before, I've really struggled my whole life to figure out what it is that I want to do. So much so that I've done a lot of different careers. And I think this is a good takeaway is that it's okay. It is okay if you, A, don't know what you want to do, and B, it's okay if you want to try a lot of things. And in my past 5 years of being professor, this was sort of my catch line is you won't know if you want to do something until you actually want to do it. The amount of times I'd have a student come to me and say, well, I think I want to be a nurse, or I think I want to be a physician or a physical therapist. And then my reply would be, well, have you ever done it? Have you ever gotten experience in it? So how do you know you want to do it if you haven't done it? And so this is just a list of all the different jobs that I've literally done since I was in high school. You know, I started from a very humble beginning of being a Subway sandwich artist. I worked for a gentleman who had his own cleaning business. I cleaned toilets, raising my hands. I'm not, it's something that I did. And then I slowly kind of worked my way up the ladder there. I've had some formative experiences that have really steered me to my current role. I had this wonderful experience doing physical therapy research at a Veterans Affairs hospital, and I actually got to use this machine that you see in your slide there called a Locomat. A great formative experience in my life helping patients with some different diseases, multiple sclerosis, to basically retrain their gait, helping to teach them to walk again. I did personal training in a nursing home. I did cardiac rehab. Another very formative experience in my life here was when I actually got to be a scrub tech in an operating room. So when you watch all of your TV dramas, your Grey's Anatomies and things like that, and they're in the operating room and the physician's standing there and says, scalpel, and there's a guy who hands them the scalpel. That was me. I actually got to do that job for the better part of a year. And that really steered my trajectory. At that point in my life, I wasn't sure if I wanted to go to medical school or if I wanted to pursue other career paths. And I'll be frank in saying that experience is something that kind of almost deterred me from going to medical school. And we could talk more about that later on in this presentation. So then I made the shift down to go and do a PhD. I was working in sort of a molecular muscle biology lab. So I was, sitting there pipetting and looking at microscopes for 8 to 12 hours a day and doing that sort of a thing. And then, as I just alluded to, I was a professor, so teaching students, helping them on their career journeys, and then recently getting into this field of regulatory affairs. So hopefully now that you have that background of who I am, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions about my background throughout this. Stephen kind of gave that introduction. If we have questions as you go along, please feel free, pop them in the chat. Stephen will stop me, he'll read them off. I'm happy to answer them as we go. Or if you have questions at the very end, that's fine as well. I'm happy to address anything about my own personal journey or about the specific career path of regulatory affairs.
We
So
do have one question already, which you might get to in your presentation. What kind of college majors could lead to a job in regulatory affairs?
yeah, I'm okay jumping to the punchline right now because it's a great question, and we will somewhat come to this. There's a lot of career paths. There's a lot of majors. Sorry, there's a lot of majors that you could go into to get into this. My background is in kinesiology. I'm in regulatory affairs. My wife is in regulatory affairs. She also comes from a life science background. Her undergrad was in biology. There's a lot of folks who have probably the majority, especially in the medical device field and regulatory, come from engineering backgrounds. That's very common. My boss right now, her background was actually in law. She actually went to law school and now she's over in regulatory. So a whole slew of different backgrounds come into it, typically within the STEM field. Math is a big one. Engineering is a big one, especially for medical devices. As you'll see here, regulatory affairs also does apply to pharmaceuticals. And I feel like in the pharmaceutical world, you get a lot more people from the biological sciences and chemistry coming into those positions. And do I see a couple more questions coming in?
That was it for the
Okay,
moment.
great. So let's now take the step back and really kind of dive deep into what regulatory affairs ultimately is. And so on your screen in front of you, going sort of from left to right, we see three different things. We see one, a bone growth stimulator, which is basically a device that's put into somebody's back to help, somebody if they broke their back, we can help to increase their bone density and help them to heal quicker. The two things that we see sort of on the right of our screen are things that are a little bit more visible nowadays, mechanical ventilation and vaccines. So how do we know it's safe to use these types of things? And well, ultimately, it is the role of different organizations, such as you see at the bottom of your screen there in the FDA, to look at the preponderance of evidence of these things and deem is this safe to ultimately use. And it's the job of regulatory affairs to basically go and these people who are at these different companies. So myself, I'm at Medtronic, which is a medical device company. There's pharmaceutical companies out there. So you probably heard the name Pfizer is a big one right now because they have one of the vaccines that's out there. And then we have biologics. These are all different things in the field of medicine that ultimately we need to know, are these safe? And it's the job of the regulatory affairs professionals to basically now take all of the evidence, whether that be clinical data from patients, whether that's benchtop data, for medical devices. We do a lot of stuff in the lab. I work on coronary stents. So these little devices that go into your coronary arteries to help open up blockages. These things we have tons of tests that we do within the laboratory. We put them on different machines. We put them through tracks. We bend them. We break them. We open them up as far as we can to see what are their limits and how safe are they. How many times can I take this device and bend it back and forth before it breaks? The answer to that is millions and millions of times, actually. And we take all that evidence and then we present it to these organizations like the FDA, and ultimately they say, yes, thumbs up, this is good, let's go for it, we can put this into people, it's safe. Or they say, you know what, I don't think this is safe. Please show us some more evidence, and there can be some negotiations with that. And again, that is the role of the regulatory affairs professional, is to kind of liaison, to be that bridge between the company and these organizations here. And so specifically, as I said, I work at Medtronic. The majority of the things that we do are medical device related. Other companies are more biologically related or pharmaceutical related. So I'm just showing you a plethora of different medical devices on the screen here. Some of them you may be scratching your head saying, really? That's a medical device? Something like a Band-Aid, as you see in the middle of your screen. Technically, a Band-Aid is a medical device. And we can put that in the same category as spinal screws, right? These are all medical devices. How they differ, though, is in basically what we call the class of the medical device. So some of them are very lower class, so they're not very risky to use. The Band-Aid is not very risky, so we call these class 1. Their approval process is very, very simple. For something a little bit more invasive, so a spinal screw or a pacemaker, a pacemaker basically being a device that gets inserted into your heart and beats for your heart. So if their sinus atrial node, the SA node in their heart stops beating, this device will go in there for them and now cause it to keep beating, which if somebody didn't have this device 50, 60, 70 years ago, they would ultimately be dead. So you can clearly see that some of these devices allow people to maintain life. In ways that they could never live before. And so how can you actually get a medical device? Well, again, it goes back to this classification scheme. So for our very, very safe devices, some of them are just over the counter, right? So Band-Aids, surgical gloves, you can basically just go to your local Walgreens or CVS and you can pick them up. You don't need to go to your doctor beforehand to get a prescription to get them. They're very easy to procure. Some of them, though, you do need a prescription. So you may need a prescription to get a wheelchair. You may need to get a prescription to get a glucose monitor. So glucose monitor being one of these devices that, as you can basically see in this picture, there's sort of a little patch that can be inserted either above the abdomen or sometimes you see in the back of the arm. And this can give you a continuous read of your blood glucose levels. And for somebody who's a diabetic, either type 1 or type 2, it's very important for them to maintain that blood glucose level within a normal limit if their body isn't able to do it naturally. And so this gives them some insights into where their blood sugar levels are, and is there an intervention they may need to do to help mitigate that? Do they need to give themselves some insulin to bring their blood glucose down? Or if their blood sugar is too low, do they need to give themselves some sugar to bring it back up to get it back into a normal level? And then lastly, kind of on the far end of the continuum, we have the surgical ones. So again, these are your more invasive ones. These are what we would call class 3 medical devices. So a pacemaker would be example, the bone screw, the stents that I alluded to that I typically work on that are getting implanted into the arteries within your heart. These are all class 3 medical devices. So as you can imagine, to get one of these devices approved, there's a lot more work that goes into it than just getting one of these devices. And so we'll talk more about what goes into that application process here in a minute. So who allows us to get these devices approved? Well, you've probably seen this 3-letter acronym before. I know it showed it previously on my slide. And so I'm just going to pause and stop for a second and make sure that you're still awake and playing along here. Does anybody know, what does the FDA stand for? And so you can either feel free to unmute yourself or you can pop it into the chat and I can kind of take a quick look there to see at what your answers ultimately are. And I just opened up my chat and I see that somebody's parents went to Florida. Go Gators. Yeah, I agree. Let's see. Oh, Federal Department of something. Yeah, we're close. Yeah. Ooh, Federal Drug Administration. The Fund Device Association. Oh, that's good. Yeah, so the FDA is the Food and Drug Administration. Is the Food and Drug Administration. And so then the next question ultimately then becomes, so what do they ultimately do? Well, so the F part, they do actually help regulate the safety of our food. So if you ever hear about food recalls, right, all of a sudden there's a salmonella outbreak within chicken or meat, or there's an E. coli outbreak within certain vegetables, if you've ever heard of those things. And now all that food is being recalled, right? Oh, don't eat onions now because they're tainted with something. Well, it's ultimately the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, that handles that. And there's a lot of different branches of the FDA. It's a very, very big organization. And like any big organization, there are smaller subparts of it. The other major part here, as you see, is that drug part, or drugs and devices. So ultimately, it is the FDA who is approving, whether that be the medical device or the pharmaceutical, or as we hear nowadays in the news all the time, the vaccines, right? The COVID vaccines and all the different pharmaceutical industries who are trying to make their own vaccine, they are now going to the FDA to present their packet of information to say, hey, here's what we have come up with. Here's our data to support our claims. Here's how many people we put it in. Here are the outcomes. This many people got infected. This is how many people who didn't get infected. These are all the side effects. Please, can you help us to get this approved for use? And so the FDA ultimately, what they do is they actually create laws, believe it or not. The FDA has laws. And so when we go and we put in our applications, and these are very lengthy applications, folks. I mean, some of these things, I mean, we're literally talking thousands of pages. And it's not like when you're in middle school or high school and you have to go and write an essay, right? I'm not talking about a 1,000-page essay here. When I say it's thousands of pages, there's a lot of writing there, but there's also a lot of data. There's test reports, there's statistical analyses that are in there, there's diagrams, there's figures, right? So it's literally a whole conglomerate of all these different things there. So we ultimately put in the application to the FDA. The FDA reviewers will look at that. They always, I'm not gonna say they sometimes, they will always come back with more questions. And then ultimately it's our job to answer those questions, to provide whatever evidence they need, to provide clarifications, and it's well within their rights. And this happens many a time. We will present our application and they'll come back and say, we want more. We want more data, or we want data on this. We want you to run these tests. And that may mean we go back to the bench, we go back into the lab, we do some more benchtop data. We may need to go and recruit more subjects. We may need to do a whole new study. And at that point, if all of a sudden we need to do a whole new study, the organization itself, in this case, Medtronic, Pfizer, we may stop and say, "Ooh, is that something that we really want to do? Is that really worth it?" And these are very difficult conversations to hash out there. Those are conversations way above my pay grade. I'll be honest in saying that. But ultimately, if we do what they say, they like what we're presenting, then they give us the approval. But that's not the end of it. Once you get approval, it's not like, hey, my job is done. Really, the work just begins at that point. And this is where I do a lot of my work, is sort of on the post-approval process. So now the device has been approved, and now we have these things that we need to follow up. We need to follow up on safety data. We need to monitor our patients for 5 years after they had this device. Every year for some of our studies, we need to keep giving the FDA updates on those studies, presenting them with safety data throughout the world. So it's a continuous process, ultimately to keep these devices on the market. And that's a very important thing. With many of these things, they may appear safe in the short term, but as you know, right, many of these studies are not done for 10 or 20 or 30 years. We conduct a study for maybe a year or 2 years. And so ultimately, they may approve the device before we actually have any long-term safety data. And so it's well within the rights of the FDA to keep asking for that data. And down the road, they may look at that data and say, wow, it turns out this isn't as safe as we thought. And they could ultimately now pull that product from the market, and they are well within their rights of doing that. So this is a constant ebb and flow. It's a constant conversation is ultimately what's taking place throughout. And you're going to see this with the COVID vaccines as well. Some of these are coming on the market now. They're coming on in very, very rapid form. Typically, and I was just listening to an interview of a gentleman who's actually works for the FDA, and he was talking about typically in the world of vaccines, it takes usually roughly between about 15 to 20 years from the first time they put it into an animal until ultimately that vaccine will get approved, right? 15 to 20 years before that approval process. And folks, we actually just did that entire process literally in less than a calendar year from when that vaccine went in an animal to now being and it's not approved. I won't go into the semantics of that word approved, but it's been authorized for an emergency use nowadays. So do not be surprised if some of these vaccines that are being used right now for emergency use, we don't see on the market down the road, because as we get more evidence behind them, maybe it turns out they were not as efficacious as we thought, or maybe they're not as safe as we thought. So there's a whole lot that gets wrapped up into this field of regulatory affairs, which needless to say, I don't ever have a boring day in my life because of what comes into my inbox every morning. All right, so here's the punchline. Here's the kicker, the major takeaway of today. Who can get a medical device approved? Raise your hand, right? Anybody, right? This is a career path for ultimate anybody. As I alluded to before, many people from a lot of different walks of life, a lot of different academic backgrounds, ultimately can come into this arena. And lastly, and this is, I think I've hammered home this slide. I'm going to skip over this slide. What do we do? I work with the FDA. I also do work with other FDA-like agencies around the world. So every single country has their own FDA equivalent, and it's an alphabet soup, let me tell you, folks. So it's FDA here in the US, we have TGA in Australia, we have PMDA in Japan, we have NMPA in China, and then we have Health Canada in, you guessed it, in Canada. So some of them aren't as unique, but needless to say, every country tends to have their own organization, and it's the same process. We put together the application, we send it on, we answer their feedback, hopefully we can get the approval, and now we can use our device, our vaccine, our pharmaceutical, our biologic within that population. And there's a lot of people who are involved in this. It's not just me. I am not a silo. I really am the last step, to be honest with you. It's all the work of the people before me who do more of the heavy lifting. We have engineers who create the device, who do our benchtop data. We have the surgeons who implant the device into clinical patients, into real life patients. We have writers who have to write up the instructions for use and make the labels and all these types of things. We have lawyers who go through copyright patents. We have the manufacturers who build it. We have the marketing specialists who can now present this information to the physicians who then will say, hey, yes, I do want to use this device. So this is definitely a team effort to get these things across the line and approved for use. And I just want to kind of show this slide, and this slide kind of transcends regulatory. It just kind of broadens your, hopefully, perspective to other careers that are within the medical device field. Whatever you're interested in, there could be a job for you within the medical device field, the pharmaceutical field, depending on what you're interested in. So right now, if you take a real inkling to something like math, well, you can go into engineering, you can go into finance, and you can work in one of these companies. If you're more interested in social sciences, you might be more suited to be in the marketing department. If you like writing, I am a full-time writer. That is my job. As a regulatory affairs specialist, I write. I write applications, I write emails, I write all these different things. If you like science, you could be a physician, right? You could be the physician who puts in these medical devices. You can be a researcher. And lastly, hey, if you like traveling, there's a job for you as well in the medical device field as a sales rep. I mean, these are people who are traveling all the time. And it's not to say that you're literally just hopping on a plane, going to Fiji and kicking your heels up on a beach. That's not the type of travel we're talking about. But you could be hopping into an airport, flying from here, there, and everywhere, presenting to physicians, uh, teaching them about your device and things like that. So there definitely are a whole lot of opportunities within this field. And that was the whole purpose of this presentation, was to kind of give you some insight into this little niche called regulatory affairs, but then also show you there's a whole slew of other jobs out there, depending upon what you may be interested in. And I am remiss of saying, not many people told me about work in the medical device field when I was in your seat. My wife was the one who stumbled upon it about 7 years ago. She's been in the field a lot longer than me. And as I was sort of transitioning out of my last role in academia, she was the one who kind of said, maybe you might want to try the medical device field. And it's been a wild 10 months, let me tell you. And I've really thoroughly enjoyed it. And I just want to give you guys this insight as well. With that, I believe I got about 7 minutes left on the clock here. I wanted to make sure I kept this short and sweet. Hopefully I kept your attention throughout. My contact information is there on the slide. So if you're a little shy and you don't want to reach out to me right now, or you need to think about some questions or something pops up into your head down the road, take a pen and paper, please write down my email. Feel free to shoot me a question. I'm more than happy to attempt to answer it. I always tell you that right now. I don't have all the answers. And if I don't, I will do my best to try and find the answer. And so with that, if anybody wants to either unmute themselves or pop it into the chat box, I am more than happy to take some of your questions here with our couple of minutes remaining. Yeah, so I see a question there from Julia. Hey, Julia. So how much technical knowledge do you need? Do you have to get all the details about the devices you test from the designers and engineers? Yeah, it's a really good question. My background is not in engineering. I feel like I've taught myself a lot about engineering in the past 10 months. From the role of regulatory, we are, and we have an acronym in our business called SME, so a subject matter expert. And so ultimately, truthfully, the technical details, that's the subject matter experts of the engineers. And so it's their job really to write up the reports and do those sorts of things. My job is to then take that complex report, maybe distill it down into its fundamentals, write up a brief summary of that, put it into our application with that report, and then hopefully then send it on to the FDA. So there's a continuum there. You don't need all the detail. You don't need to be an expert in bone screws or glucose monitors or stents before you get these jobs. Right now I'm considered the SME of regulatory. So it's my job and responsibility to be the expert in what do we need to present to the FDA to get this certain device approved. And again, it goes back to that team effort thing, right? I have people on my team who are the experts on the technical knowledge. So within our immediate team, we have what's called a core team, and there are members of each of the different functions on that core team. So we have a representative from regulatory, but we also then have representatives from clinical, from research and design, from quality assurance, from finance, from marketing. and then you have somebody who's project management who kind of oversees it all. So hopefully that illustration gives you a big example of how much integration there is in this process. I see another question here. Have there been times where a medical device has been approved and later taken back? The answer is yes. I can't give you examples off the top of my head. I could actually, but I don't want to. Yeah, it's actually very common. You can literally just go and Google these things, medical device recalls. And unfortunately, they do happen quite often where products are on the market and then they get taken off the market for a whole host of different reasons, whether it be a safety concern, even something as simple as mislabeling can cause a product to be recalled. And now we need to pull back product, relabel it, and then put it back out into the field as well. And regulatory plays a key role in that. So I kind of alluded to that earlier in this presentation where just because the product gets approved, right, the job isn't done. Honestly, that's when the job really takes off from our work point of view. But good question. And I'm happy to answer even any questions about my own personal background.
All right. Well, looks like there's no other questions. Kurt, thank you very much for coming and presenting today on alternate careers in STEM. And thank you all for joining us as part of the North Bay Science Discovery Day. We appreciate, hope you're able to attend some of our other sessions today. So thank you very much. And I think that ends this session.